Richard Matthews adjusted the worn baseball cap on his head, checking his reflection in the side mirror of his ordinary Honda Civic. Gone was the custom-tailored Italian suit, the Rolex watch, and the confident stride that commanded boardrooms. In their place sat a middle-aged man in faded jeans, a simple gray hoodie, and scuffed sneakers. Even his usually perfectly groomed hair was deliberately tousled with a few days' worth of stubble, completing the transformation. As CEO of Golden Griddle Diners, a chain of 127 restaurants across the Midwest, Richard had built his empire from a single location his grandfather had opened in 1952. But somewhere along the way, between quarterly reports and expansion meetings, he'd lost touch with the heartbeat of his business, the people who made it run. The recent drop in employee satisfaction scores and several anonymous complaints had finally pushed him to take this unconventional step. The bell above the door chimed as Richard stepped into the Oakdale location, one of his busiest spots. The familiar aroma of coffee, bacon, grease, and fresh bread hit him immediately. The black and white checkered floor showed more wear than he remembered, and the vinyl booth seats had small tears that hadn't been repaired. "Sit anywhere you'd like, hon," called out a waitress with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Dorothy, and Richard recognized her face from employee files. She'd been with the company for nearly 15 years. Seeing her up close, he noticed the tired lines around her eyes and the way she favored her left leg when she walked. Richard chose a corner booth that gave him a clear view of the kitchen and most of the dining area. The lunch rush was in full swing, and he watched with growing fascination as the intricate dance of service unfolded before him. "What can I get started for you?" Dorothy appeared at his table, notepad ready, her smile warm despite the obvious exhaustion. "I'll take a beef sandwich, medium, with a side of fries," Richard replied. "And coffee black." "Coming right up, sweetie. That's our most popular sandwich." "You picked well." When Dorothy returned with his beef sandwich, Richard was struck by the generous portion and the care with which it was presented. The beef was tender and flavorful, the bun fresh and lightly toasted. "Everything tastes all right?" Dorothy asked, stopping by his table with a fresh pot of coffee. "It's excellent, actually. Better than I expected." Dorothy's face lit up with genuine pride. "We take good care of our regulars here, but even the first-timers get our best. That's how Mr. Matthews would want it." "Well, I assume that's how he'd want it. Can't say I've ever met the man personally." Richard nearly choked on his coffee, managing to cover it with a cough. "You've worked here long? 15 years this December. Started when my youngest was in elementary school. It's been good to me. Mostly decent folks to work with. Steady hours." Something flickered across her face, but she quickly replaced it with her professional smile. As Dorothy moved away, Richard noticed her stopping at the service station where two younger waitresses were counting their tip money from the lunch shift. Their hushed conversation was barely audible over the dinner noise, but something about their postures, heads close together, voices low and tense, caught his attention. He shifted slightly in his booth, angling his ear toward them. "I swear it's getting worse every week," one of them whispered. The name tag on her uniform read Jessica. "I counted my tips 3 times yesterday, and I know that for top left me $20, but when I picked up my envelope, there was only 15. The second waitress, Maria, nodded grimly. "Same thing happened to me on Tuesday. That businessman at table 12, he specifically told me the tip was for excellent service, handed me a $25 bill right into my hand. But somehow only 18 made it into my pocket." Richard's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the sandwich forgotten. This wasn't possible. Golden Griddle had always maintained a strict policy. Tips belonged entirely to the servers. "Do you think someone's taking money from the register?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's not the register. It's happening to the tip pools, too. Dorothy mentioned it last week. Said her Friday night take was lighter than it should have been. And you know Dorothy keeps track of every penny." Maria glanced around nervously before continuing. I think management is taking a cut under the table." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The sandwich in his hand suddenly felt like cardboard, his appetite completely gone. But that's illegal, isn't it? Jessica's voice carried a note of desperation. I need every dollar. My daughter's daycare costs are going up next month. Of course, it's illegal. But what are we going to do about it? Complain to corporate. You know how that goes. They'll just find some reason to cut our hours or let us go altogether. Jobs like this aren't easy to find. Richard sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. Who could be doing this and why? The regional manager for this district was David Chin, a man Richard had promoted himself 3 years ago. David had seemed trustworthy, dedicated with excellent performance reviews and glowing reports from all his locations. As he sat there trying to process what he'd overheard, Richard began to notice other details. Dorothy's tired eyes weren't just from physical exhaustion. There was a worried, worn-down quality to her expression that spoke of financial stress. Amy, the teenage waitress who had been so kind to a young mother, had holes in her shoes that she tried to cover with black marker. These were his people. These women had dedicated years of their lives to making his restaurant successful, and someone he trusted, was stealing from them. Richard's hands clenched into fists under the table. Whoever was responsible had no idea what they just unleashed, but he couldn't react now. He needed proof, concrete evidence that would not only expose the thief, but ensure they faced the full consequences of their actions. As he paid his bill, leaving a generous $20 tip in cash directly in Dorothy's hand, Richard made a silent promise. Whatever was happening in his restaurant, whoever was stealing from his employees, it was going to stop. Walking back to his Honda, Richard's mind was already formulating a plan. He wouldn't be Richard Matthews' CEO for much longer. For the next few weeks, he'd be just another regular customer, someone forgettable and invisible, watching and learning and gathering the evidence he needed to make this right. 3 days later, Richard returned to the Oakdale diner wearing a different disguise, a faded flannel shirt and work boots that made him look like a construction worker grabbing lunch. Dorothy wasn't working that day, but he recognized Maria behind the counter. As he waited for his food, he pulled out a worn paperback novel, using it as cover while his ears stayed tuned to the staff conversations around him. Table 6 is getting antsy about their order, called out Amy, as she rushed past the service station where Maria was preparing drinks. Tell them 2 more minutes, Maria replied. I swear everything feels harder when you're worried about money. Amy paused, glancing around before stepping closer to Maria. You're still having the tip thing happen? Every single shift. Yesterday was the worst. That anniversary couple at table 12 left me $30. I watched them count it out. But when I checked my envelope at the end of the night, there was only $22. Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's $8 just gone. Richard's grip tightened on his book. He'd spent the last 3 days researching his own company's policies, double-checking every procedure and protocol. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there any legitimate reason for tips to be reduced before reaching the servers. Have you talked to Mr. Chin about it? Amy asked, referring to the regional manager. Maria let out a bitter laugh. You mean the guy who just bought a brand new BMW? Yeah, I'm sure he's really concerned about our missing tip money. She paused, then added with venom. You know what Dorothy told me yesterday? She said Chin told her there was a new house policy about equipment maintenance fees coming out of tips. Since when do servers pay for kitchen equipment repairs? Richard felt his stomach drop. David Chin, the man he personally promoted, was not only stealing from employees, but lying about company policy to cover it up. That doesn't sound right, Amy said. My boyfriend works at that pizza place downtown, and they never take money from tips for anything. Of course, it's not right. But what choice do we have? Dorothy's got 2 kids in college. Jessica's a single mom. And I've got my grandmother's medical bills. We can't afford to lose these jobs, even if someone's stealing from us. The casual acceptance in Maria's voice made Richard's heart ache. These women had been pushed into a corner, forced to accept theft because they couldn't risk unemployment. A new voice joined the conversation. Jessica. I counted my tips from last night 3 times, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. $47 in credit card tips, 18 in cash. But somehow my envelope only had 58 total. How much is missing? Maria asked. $7. It doesn't sound like much, but over a week, over a month, that's my daughter's school lunch money. That's gas in my car. Jessica's voice cracked slightly. I worked a double shift yesterday. 12 hours on my feet, dealing with difficult customers, cleaning up messes, and someone just takes part of what I earned. Richard wanted to stand up right then, to reveal himself and promise that every stolen penny would be returned, but he forced himself to remain seated, to listen, to gather more information. Dorothy thinks it's been going on for months, Maria continued. She started keeping her own records after she noticed her Friday night tips were consistently lower than they should be. Why don't we all keep records? Jessica suggested. Write down every tip we receive, compare it to what we get in our envelopes. And then what? Present our evidence to Chin? Maria shook her head. He'll just say we're mistaken, that we miscounted, or worse, he'll find reasons to cut our hours or fire us altogether. Richard had heard enough to confirm his worst fears. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a computer glitch. Someone was systematically stealing from his employees, and they were using their economic vulnerability to keep them quiet. That night, Richard sat in his home office surrounded by employee files, financial reports, and performance reviews. David Chen's personnel file lay open before him, and Richard studied it with new eyes. 3 years ago, David had seemed like the perfect candidate for regional manager, ambitious, detail-oriented, with impressive numbers. But now, those very qualities took on a sinister cast. Richard pulled up the profit reports for the 7 locations under David's management. All showed consistent growth. Labor costs were down across the board. On paper, David Chin was Richard's most successful regional manager. But if David was skimming tips systematically across multiple locations, those artificially low labor costs made perfect sense. Servers working for less effective hourly wages would be desperate to keep their jobs, less likely to complain about working conditions. Richard called his older brother, Michael. Mike, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If you discovered that someone you trusted completely had been stealing from your employees systematically, deliberately, what would your first instinct be? Richard poured out the entire story, the disguise, the overheard conversations, the mounting evidence of systematic tip theft. Think about the timeline, Michael said. When did your employee satisfaction scores start declining? Richard pulled up the relevant reports. The pattern was unmistakable. The problems had started approximately 18 months ago, right after David had settled into his role. It's been going on for a year and a half, Mike, maybe longer. If this is as systematic as you think, David's not working alone. You don't set up tip skimming operations across 7 locations without help. I have to go back, Richard said. I need more evidence before I can act. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard became a fixture at the Oakdale diner. He rotated his disguises, always ordered the beef sandwich, always sat in booths rather than at the counter, always paid in cash with generous tips. The staff began to recognize him as that nice regular guy without ever really seeing him. Richard had developed a system. He would arrive during different shifts, carefully noting which managers were on duty, observing the interactions between staff and supervision. David Chin visited the Oakdale location every Thursday afternoon, always during the slower period between lunch and dinner rush. How are we doing on labor costs this week? Richard overheard David ask the assistant manager, Brad. Good, sir. Right on target with corporate guidelines. Excellent. And the staff? No complaints? No issues with tip reporting? The question was asked casually, but Richard caught the underlying threat. Through careful questioning across multiple visits, Richard pieced together the full scope of the scheme. Tips were being skimmed at an average rate of 15% across all servers. Credit card tips were easier to manipulate than cash, with the difference buried in complex payroll reports. Richard expanded his investigation to other locations in David's district. The pattern was identical. Subtle signs of financial stress among servers, carefully worded explanations about new policies. At the Riverside location, he overheard a conversation that made his hands clench into fists. "My son needs new glasses and I just can't make the numbers work," one woman said. "I used to be able to count on weekend tips to cover extras like that." "I know, honey. We're all struggling, but at least we still have jobs, right?" The resignation in their voices broke Richard's heart. The investigation phase was complete. Tomorrow, it would be time to take action. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he spread the evidence across his office conference table at 6 a.m. 2 weeks of meticulous investigation had yielded a paper trail so damning that even he was shocked by its scope. The centerpiece was a detailed spreadsheet cross-referencing server schedules with reported tip amounts across 4 locations. The pattern was mathematically impossible to dismiss. Every server in David Chen's district was losing exactly 15% of their credit card tips. But the smoking gun lay in the financial documents. David wasn't just skimming tips. He was systematically stealing approximately $3,200 per month from the Oakdale location alone. Across his entire district, the theft totaled nearly $18,000 monthly, over $320,000 in the past year and a half. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator. "Found something. Call immediately." "Margaret, what did you find?" "Richard, your instincts were right, but it's worse than you thought. David Chin has 3 different bank accounts under variations of his name. The deposits match your timeline perfectly. But here's the kicker, he's been doing this before." Richard's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I dug into his previous employment. That glowing recommendation from his last job, the restaurant chain he worked for closed 2 locations in his district due to unexplained financial irregularities 6 months after he left. No charges were filed because they couldn't prove individual responsibility. But the pattern matches what you're describing perfectly. There's more," Margaret continued. "I found evidence of supplier kickbacks. David's been approving inflated invoices from 3 different vendors and pocketing the difference. How much total are we talking about? Conservative estimate? Nearly $500,000 over 2 years. And Richard, your COO Patricia Williams signed off on several of the vendor contract renewals. Either she's incredibly negligent or she's involved." Richard finished the sentence, his voice hollow. Richard's phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed David Chen's number. "Richard, I hope I'm not calling too early, but I wanted to discuss the quarterly performance reviews for my district. The numbers are looking exceptional again this quarter." The casual arrogance in David's voice filled Richard with cold fury. "Actually, David, I think we should meet in person to discuss your district's performance. There are some interesting patterns I'd like to review with you. Of course, I'm always happy to share the strategies that have made my location so successful. 2 o'clock, Oakdale location. And David, bring your district financial reports. All of them." After hanging up, Richard made one final call to the company's law firm. Golden Griddle would be filing criminal charges against David Chin. At exactly 1:45 p.m., Richard sat in his familiar corner booth at the Oakdale diner, wearing his construction worker disguise one final time. The manila folder beside him contained copies of bank records, financial statements, and witness testimonies. Hidden in his jacket pocket, a small recording device captured everything about to unfold. Dorothy approached with her usual warm smile. "Your regular spot, huh? Beef sandwich?" "Actually, Dorothy, I'm meeting someone today. But before they arrive, I need to tell you something important." Richard's voice was gentle but serious. "That money you've been missing from your tips, the equipment maintenance fees, it's all going to stop today." Dorothy's face went pale. I'm not sure what you mean." "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know what's been happening here, and I'm going to fix it." Before Dorothy could respond, David Chin walked through the door, his expensive suit and confidence stride a stark contrast to the worn uniforms of the servers he'd been systematically robbing. "You must be the gentleman I'm meeting about district performance," David said, extending his hand. Richard stood, accepting the handshake. "Actually, David, I think you know exactly who I am." With deliberate movements, Richard removed his baseball cap and looked directly into David's eyes. The recognition was instant. David's face went ashen, his confident posture crumbling. "Mr. Matthews, what are you doing here? Why are you dressed like a regular customer? Someone you'd never notice while you were stealing from my employees?" Richard's voice carried across the suddenly silent dining room. Every server, every customer had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. Dorothy gasped. You're the owner." "I am. And Dorothy, Jessica, Maria, Amy, all of you, I owe you an apology. I failed to protect you from someone I trusted." Richard opened the manila folder, spreading financial documents across the table. "David Chin has stolen over $300,000 in tips from servers across his district. Money that belonged to you." The dining room erupted in shocked murmurs. Jessica dropped her order pad, tears streaming down her face. "That's just the tips," Richard continued, his eyes never leaving David's face. "The supplier kickbacks, the fraudulent expense reports. We're looking at nearly $500,000 in total theft." David tried to recover. "Mr. Matthews, there's been a misunderstanding. The operational efficiency programs I implemented were designed to. There's no misunderstanding." Richard's voice cut through David's lies like a blade. "I have bank records showing 3 separate accounts where you deposited stolen money. I have documented evidence of your 15% tip skimming system. I know about the equipment maintenance fee scam. I even know this isn't your first time. You did the same thing at your previous job." The color drained completely from David's face. Around the dining room, servers were crying. "Every penny will be returned," Richard announced to the room. "Every server who was cheated will receive full restitution with interest. And David Chen will be facing criminal charges for theft, fraud, and conspiracy." As if summoned by Richard's words, 2 police officers entered the diner, followed by a woman in a business suit carrying legal documents. "David Chen," one officer said, "you're under arrest for grand theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." As David was read his rights and led away in handcuffs, Richard turned to address his employees. "I know I can't undo the months of financial stress you've endured because of my failure to protect you, but I can promise you this: new management oversight policies start immediately. Anonymous reporting systems for any concerns. And most importantly, I will never again be so removed from your daily reality that something like this could happen." Dorothy stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Matthews, we thought you didn't care about us little people." "You're not little people, Dorothy. You're the heart of this company. You're the reason customers come back, the reason Golden Griddle exists at all, and I should have been here working alongside you, understanding your struggles." Richard's voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry. It took a disguise for me to see what was really happening in my own restaurants." Over the following weeks, Richard instituted sweeping changes. Patricia Williams was suspended pending investigation. New financial oversight systems were implemented across all locations. Most importantly, Richard began working regular shifts at different restaurants, ensuring he maintained connection with the people who made his company successful. The restitution checks totaled over $400,000, returning stolen wages to more than 60 employees across David's former district. David Chin pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. But for Richard, the real victory wasn't in David's conviction. It was in Dorothy's smile when she received her first full honest paycheck in 2 years, and in Jessica's relief when she could finally afford her daughter's school supplies without worry. Golden Griddle had weathered the storm of betrayal and emerged stronger, more transparent, and more committed than ever to treating its employees with the dignity and respect they deserved.